Okay, what am I doing? Nope. There we go. How do I work this thing? There we go. So this is Piper who gave me a Rodney Stark stained glass as I had long wished for. So thanks, Piper. That's so good. Oh, I'm so excited. More decorations for my office. I love it. All right, so we're gonna get started here. I'm gonna turn the dot cam off because who cares about that? All righty. So where is my PowerPoint? There we go. Okay, I think everything's working now. So we are going to get going here. All right. Ooh, I had almost forgot. I was so excited about the stained glass, I forgot to get my handy pen out. All right. So last class, obviously, we finished up talking about Stark and Fink's The Churching of America, winners and losers in the religious landscape, 1776 to 2005, right? And, largely, as I said last time, it's the last you'll see of Rodney, except in, occasional mentions for the rest of the course. And we're on to kind of the last little bit of our course going on here. What's the, is this important? Oh, okay. Well, that's good news. Okay, so we're going to start talking about, so we've set up the theory, right? And we've now got, I think, a good base in theories of religion, a good, really strong, I know it's taken us to like the middle part of March to get through the preamble of the course. And we've got a good basis in what is religion, how religion works, our sociological theories of religion, and our theories of secularization, and a couple of interesting, case studies from Stark and then from Stark and Fink as to how some of these theories could be applied in practice, looking at real-world examples of religion. Okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to pivot to talking about the religious landscape today. So what does religion actually look like today? And honestly, I will say, I redid this, and if you go on Canvas, you'll see I've got it labeled as, Religious Landscape 2026. Every time I redo this, the story gets more complicated. And it's, I will say, compared to, I think, the very linear and straightforward lectures we've had so far, this is a bit of a mess because the religion data in and of itself is a bit of a mess, right? So I'm going to do my best to sort of tell you what the religious landscape looks like today in Canada and in the United States, and just kind of try and make sense of big changes over time. Okay, so how to put this? All right, our religious landscape in Canada, right? And here, this data only goes to about 2011. So it's a little bit out of date, but don't worry, I've got updated data for 2021 here, but I like kind of how this visualizes things, and this is from Pew Research. They haven't done an update on Canada in a while, but thankfully we have some census data that we can look at. Okay, so big changes over time, right? We look at Canada's kind of religious trajectory. overall, right, and kind of as you'd expect, it is downwards, right? Canadians are growing less religious, and like the big shift has been, right, we've seen a big, I guess in this period, 1971 to 2011, huge decline in people who call themselves Protestant, right? Catholics, a marked decline, but less so. Growth in other religions, and we'll see how this plays out, right? This continues, mostly driven by immigration, but the biggest kind of growth is the growth of the religiously unaffiliated, or what we sort of, usually call the nuns, or nothing in particular, right? Now, generally speaking, a couple of things to kind of point out with our 1971 to 2011 data, right? As of 2001, about 72% of Canadians still call themselves Christian. That's now much closer to 50%, right? That number's declined pretty significantly even since then. Of the Protestants, Protestants are a hard one to talk about. When we get to some of the American data, they'll often split it between mainline and evangelicals. We haven't done that as well in Canadian data, but evangelicals grew pretty robustly in Canada, if kind of, they're small, from a small base, but they grew relatively robustly. Our older Protestant traditions, what you would call the mainline, right? We talked about this, we talked about the Churching of America, have seen pretty stark declines. And I'll show you how stark in a couple of slides, right? The biggest declines were, among the United Church of Canada, the Episcopal or Anglican Church, and the Lutheran Church, all of which have seen really, really sharp declines. Evangelicals, kind of roughly flat, but as we'll see, on my next slide here, a little bit of growth in, I'll show you. Why don't I just show you? Okay. All right, so this is the updated data for Canada, and here, I owe these slides to Lisa Wilkins-Laflamme at University of Waterloo, who took the census data and sort of did the data visualization on it, saving me the trouble of doing so. So what do we have, right? As I think you can see, no religion, by the time we go to the 2021 census, which is our most recent big data, right? So 10 years on from here, had grown pretty robustly, right? So in 2011, no religion, it's about 24%. By 2021, right, that has grown to over a third of Canadians reporting no religion. Basically, every Christian group is down, right? Some by bigger measures than others, right? In the 10-year period from 2011 to 2021, the United Church roughly halved in terms of its percentage of the population. The Catholic Church dropped about 10%, right? So while the Catholic Church had held steady for a long time, it's now seen pretty consistent drops, and you see the magnitude of it, right? About 2 million fewer Catholics in Canada. And everyone else, right? The Anglicans dropped a bit. The Lutherans were pretty small, but dropped a bit. Presbyterians, also really small, dropped a bit. So the Christian Orthodox, so if we look at Eastern Orthodox, like Greek, Russian, and Coptic Orthodox, roughly flat, right, as a percentage of the population, though there's more of them, in gross numbers. So their population has grown a little bit. And really the only Christian group that has seen any growth is other Christian, which we're probably saying evangelical and non-denominational Christian. Like I said, pretty robust growth here from about 10% of the population to about 11, and a growth of about 1 million more people in these categories, right, or in that particular category. And then if we take our religions that are largely driven in terms of growth by immigration, right, we see Islam up 1.5% roughly, Hinduism about 1%, and Sikhism like 0.7%, but all with pretty robust numerical growth. as a total percent of the population. Not a big jump, but lots more people that belong to these religions. And Buddhism, right, basically flat at the end of the day, a 0.1% drop. Judaism, a 0.1% drop, and again, basically flat, slightly, Buddhists are slightly smaller numbers, Jewish is slightly bigger, and then indigenous spirituality, right, again, slight growth in numbers, but it's really small. Right? We're talking 64,000 people that report having indigenous spirituality. And then other religions, the things that don't fit, and these could be lots of things. Again, probably mostly driven by immigration, but with, a 0.2% growth and a pretty good 100,000 extra people in that category. Okay, now, sorry, this is a messy slide. But I do think this is some good data visualization. All right, so if we look at, and this is a slightly longer time frame here. So we see 1971 to 2021. This is the United Church of Canada, right? So the United Church of Canada used to be Canada's second largest religious group, right? The second largest denomination of Christianity in Canada after the Roman Catholic Church. And in 1971, it was, almost 1 in 5 Canadians that belonged to the United Church. As you see, things have not gone so great for the United Church. They are now down, by 2021 to about 3%, right? So, a kind of catastrophic decline for the United Church. Catholics, right? Oh, and I wanted to say, now I'm thinking of Catholics, so I have to make a comment, because someone was like, oh, wow, you know a lot of priests. That must mean you're Catholic. So I went through my phone. I have 3 priests in my contacts, which probably sounds like a lot to some people. I have 12 evangelical Protestant pastors in my phone, as contacts. Some of them are close friends, some of them are not. But I have, 4 times as many evangelical Protestants in my contacts as compared to Catholics. So make of that what you will. I don't know if that matters, but if you're thinking, oh wow, knowing 3 priests must mean you're Catholic. Well, I mean, I know 4 times as many evangelical Protestant pastors. So there you go. Okay. Now, Catholics. Still, right, a pretty large chunk of the population calls themselves Catholic. Catholicism has a certain advantage, especially over a church like the United Church, in that it's an international church, right? It's global. And so you do get immigration from places like the Philippines, from Latin America, and from parts of Africa where there are a lot of Roman Catholics, which has probably helped buoy the number a little bit. But yeah, down from 46%, almost 1 in 2. Like if you were back in 1971, and you were just walking down the street and you were just counting, like roughly every second person you would have met, slightly less, would have been Catholic, right? And now it's only about 1 in 3, right? Slightly less than 1 in 3 people that you meet are Roman Catholic or identify as Roman Catholic. Okay, all of our others here, and again, I think these are all kind of interesting. Okay, well, what do we have? 54% of people in Quebec say they're Roman Catholic. More about Quebec in a sec. 12% of people in BC say they're Catholic. So there's major regional differences. And yeah, 29% of men say they're Roman Catholic compared to 31% of women, right? So slightly fewer men than women. Okay, I don't even know if the United Church is worth commenting on. 12% of people in Newfoundland and Labrador are still affiliated with the United Church. 3% of men, okay. All right, so Hindus, right? What do we say about Hindus? Growing, right? Over 800,000 people, right? So not quite 1 million people yet, but maybe by 2026 they are. We'll have to wait for the 2031 census to find out, but of course you'll all be gone and probably won't care anymore. So there's that. But since you're trapped here with me, and I care, as of 2021, right, almost 1 million people, and I'm sure it's getting close, or has passed 1 million people by now. So about 4% of people in Ontario identify as Hindu. That's the largest proportion of any province. It's only 0.2%, man, you'd be the lonely Hindu in Newfoundland and Labrador at 0.2% of the population. And yeah, slightly more men here than women identify as Hindu. All right, so, and again, hey, Sikhism as well, slightly more men than women. Probably more men coming to work in Canada, right? And maybe either unmarried or bringing family over later would be my guess on that. All right, so Sikhs, about almost 6% of people in BC are Sikhs. That's the biggest proportion of any percentage in Canada. Apparently there are no Sikhs in Nunavut. It's pretty cold. Can't blame them. I wouldn't want to move to Nunavut either. Not because it's not lovely, because it's really freaking cold. And yeah, slightly more men than women. And all right, 7%. So almost getting close to 1 in 10 people in Ontario identify as Muslim. Not quite 1 in 10. Again, apparently Muslim immigration to Nunavut has yet to sort of catch on. And yeah, slightly more men than women, right? And again, probably driven by a lot of young men moving for work. So, a little bit male dominated. Again, not a huge difference, but slightly male dominated. Okay, so, Catholics. All right, let's talk about Catholics. Sorry, these charts are in French, but it's the best I could find. It's not that hard to figure out, right? So the change in the number of Catholics in each of the Canadian provinces between 2011 and 2021, and then our raw number of Catholics over here, right? So, nombre de catholiques haussiens de chaque province canadienne 2011 à 2021, right? So the total number of Catholics. All right. So what does this chart tell us? Well, basically, Catholic identification is down across the board nationally, right? So in most, if we look at, say, Alberta, right, down a little bit, slightly less than Saskatchewan, right? So 3%, 10%. The big story here, I think, is Quebec, right? Because Quebec, Canada's second largest province, and the province where, half of people identified as Catholic, but that is kind of changing over time. And right, we see it in the raw numbers here, right? Back in, oops, I covered up my numbers. Where's my eraseur? This is not French, that is Englishy gibberish. All right, so back in 2011, right, what did we have? Basically 500,775,745 Catholics in Quebec. And then it's down by, let's say, a little bit more than 1 million by 2021. Okay, and then Ontario, right, a decline as well, but not as big, right? It's still in the 3 million range in both of them. Okay, so what does this tell us, right? And why is this kind of important and interesting? Well, what I would kind of posit is that what's happening here, right, in this kind of 10-year span, is the Catholics in Quebec are largely failing to replace themselves generationally, right? So Quebec, as you probably know, if you know anything about Canadian history, right, for the longest time was an overwhelmingly Catholic province, right? The province has long been dominated, obviously, by French descendants who are overwhelmingly Catholic. And up until the 1960s, Catholicism was a really central part of Quebec identity. But what happens in Quebec in the 1960s is something called the Quiet Revolution, and the whole society sort of takes a soft, quiet U-turn away from Roman Catholicism, right? It de-emphasizes Catholicism, it secularizes really, really rapidly. Now, what ends up happening in Quebec is that Catholic identity is robust for a while, right? Basically, people continue to identify, at least culturally, as Catholic up until the present, right? So people will still say, they may not be weekly attenders, and Quebec has extremely low weekly attendance rates. Somewhere in the range of like 5% of Quebecers attend religious services weekly. But most people continue to identify as Catholic, and might still get baptized, right? They might still get married in the church, potentially. Now, what happens though over time, and this is what's sometimes referred to as the cut flower phenomenon. So like you cut you go out in the field. If you've ever been out to a field picking flowers, that now sounds weird now that I'm saying it. Most people just go to a store to buy flowers, but let's say you went out and cut flowers, right? What happens with a cut flower? It'll stay nice for a little bit. But if you put it in a vase and some water with some of that like blue powder that they give you at the store, but eventually, it'll wither and it'll die, right? And this is sort of like Catholicism in Quebec. It's a cut flower, right? People don't go anymore. The society is largely secularized. And for a while, people will still say, oh yeah, I'm Roman Catholic, right? Because all Quebecers are Roman Catholic. It's part of the cultural identity. But over time, people eventually drop that. And as older people die, right, the older people in Quebec, maybe the silent generation and the older end of the baby boomers die, the younger generations no longer consider themselves Catholic, so the number of Catholics drops precipitously, basically as it fails to replace itself from a generational perspective. And so you get big, big drops, and I think that's what's happening in Quebec. Now, I think that's largely happening across the country, right? I think it's happening in Ontario as well. It's just that at the end of the day, number of Catholics is a lot smaller. The number of Catholics is a lot smaller, and the other parts of Canada, I would say, haven't as aggressively secularized as Quebec. Okay. Oh, good. No questions. Okay. So, U.S. Catholics face a similar thing. Now, the kind of difference with Catholicism in the U.S. is it perpetually kind of hovers around 20% of the population, right? And it's been there forever. Now, that doesn't mean that like the Catholic Church in the United States is doing particularly well, because if you know anything about American immigration patterns, a lot of the immigration in the U.S. is from Latin America, right? Latin America still overwhelmingly Catholic, though how intensely Catholic is another question, and a question entirely for a different course. But they kind of get this perpetual, shall we say, drip of Latin American immigrants bringing Catholicism back in. So the fact that they're just at 20% suggests pretty significant kind of losses generation by generation that's only being barely backfilled by immigration from an overwhelmingly Catholic region. Okay, so this chart, and by the way, I've decided just to bludgeon you to death with 1,000 charts in this unit. It's all charts all the time, every day. You're welcome. I love these charts. They just tell such an interesting story. By the way, just so you know, I'm going to warn you about this. On the final exam, I have a whole question section that's entitled Charts About Religion, and I just give you a chart, and you got to tell me what it's about. So if you want to take the W and withdraw, what was that? I promise it's not that bad. If you've been to class, as you clearly all are, it will be super easy, except that there's 1,000 of these, so maybe not. Okay, this comes from Ryan Burge, right? He's not at Eastern Illinois anymore. I realize now he's at University of Washington. He moved there just recently to take a new job. So I've been saying he's at the wrong place for a while. Okay, so what is this chart? All right, so share attending services nearly every week or more. And what do we see here, right? Well, in the 1970s, right, and this is GSS data, right, from the General Social Survey, this super longitudinal survey run in the US. If we go back to 1970, right, or about 1972, because that's where the data starts, Catholics were the most likely to be attending weekly or more, with over half of Catholics saying that they attended, every week or more than that. As we move forward in time, though, towards 2024, what we find in 2024 is that Catholics are now the least likely to attend weekly at, basically about a quarter, 25%, right? So the story of American Catholicism is largely one of kind of gradual sort of disaffiliation and less frequent religious service attending. And evangelicals, right? Different story. Evangelicals basically go from sort of, I guess just below Catholics overall to the most likely to attend, with 55% of them saying they attend once a week or more. And we got our black Protestants kind of in the middle, right? They've been pretty steady, about 35 or 37 to 40%. And then the main line, right? It was about 30 back in 1970, and it's about 26, 27% in 2024. So slow decline for the main line in general, and that's just religious service attendance. We'll talk more about we'll talk more about what the American landscape looks like in general in a second. Okay, so if we look at our over time, our minority religions, in terms of their growth, right, it looks pretty explosive, right? The number is still really small in terms of the Canadian population. So anyone from like Rebel News or some right-wing outlet that says that, any day now we're going to be living under Sharia law because we've been taken over by Muslims, you might want to be like, yeah, they're like 7% of the population in Ontario and 5% of the country overall. So that's pretty unlikely that that's going to happen anytime soon. But conspiracy theories aside, right? Percentage of the population who report being Muslim, Hindu, or Sikh have more than doubled in 20 years, right? And this is all immigration, right? I guess Muslims do have larger families even when they come, but this number is largely driven by immigration, right? Okay, and you see the growth, right? All of those, except for Jewish, which has gotten smaller, all of them have seen kind of really big growth. Especially if you compare 2001 to 2021, but consistently growing as more people from these religious groups come to Canada. Okay, so this data is now a little bit out of date, right? Because it only goes to about 2020, so it's 6 years out of date. When we look at Canada, though, what do we see? So all generations, right, are disaffiliating or going from, religious to, what we classify in Canada as unaffiliated or no religion. All of our generational cohorts are moving in the direction of being less affiliated, right? So our silence, right? Obviously, there's not that many silents left at this point, but even of the silents that are still around, right? Fewer of them are affiliated with a religious group than they were in 1985, right? The boomers, right? Still pretty flat, but by 2020, more of them had disaffiliated. Gen X, even more. And of course, we see the millennials here. And this doesn't include any Gen Z data. Millennials pass 50%, right? So more than half of millennials by 2020 said that they had no religious affiliation. So in terms of, religious affiliation, they went from a starting point of I guess about a quarter saying they had no religious affiliation to over half, right? By the time they sort of are in their 30s. Okay, ooh, this one's fun. Kind of. Okay. If you want to talk religion, right? So we've talked Europe and America before, right? Because we're talking about Stark and the no secularization model of secularization, right? This is comparing US states to European countries in terms of religiosity. And basically, there's only, Utah and North Dakota are about as religious as Poland, so is Alabama, right? Arkansas, all the way down through North Carolina are roughly as religious as Cyprus, the South, right? Texas, I guess Wyoming's not in the South, Kentucky, Maryland, Ireland, Ireland's not a US state yet. Who knows what happens after Greenland goes? Ireland might be next, but not a US state yet, right? So, you have a whole bunch of US states, right, kind of in the Ireland to Portugal range. But basically, what we see is most American states are considerably more religious than most places in Europe, with a few outliers, right? Italy, that's where the Pope is, so I guess that makes sense. Poland, right, very Catholic still, but only 40% weekly attendance. Slovakia, again, kind of an outlier. But then, what we typically think of as European stats, right? We got at the high end, wow, Lithuania really burning it up at about 12% weekly attendance. The UK still at about 12% in this particular data set from the, European Social Survey in 2023. But then, like Sweden and Iceland, Norway and Finland all at like 5%. Belgium, Germany. Hey, remember when Max Weber said nobody in Germany goes to church? Like nothing, and they certainly wouldn't if they had to pay for it. Well, nothing has changed, right? It's only about 6% of Germans who attend church. And then, some other ones thrown in there for good measure. Now that's it, right? Just keep in mind, America, with the exception of a few European states, remains consistently more religious than Europe, right? The European average being 14% weekly attendance, and the American average being about 25. Okay. Yes, it was the Quiet Revolution. And just to confuse things later in this 49 slide deck, I will talk about the Quiet Revival, so just to confuse you. But the Quiet Revival doesn't happen in Quebec, so don't worry, you can keep those separate. Alrighty. Where's my mousey mouse? Okay. So we're going to shift off to the USA, right? So now here we are talking about the US. And one of the things that I will say, unless otherwise noted, I'm talking about the United States. One of the things that's really interesting about the US, and one of the things I think is really unfortunate about Canada, is we tend to have much better American data on all sorts of things, but religion in particular, than we do in Canada. For whatever reason, Canadian social scientists are not that interested in questions of religion. And I'll put it this way. One of the absolute leading sociologists of religion in Canada is a guy named Joel Thiessen. I actually have met Joel. Of all the people that I mentioned, I actually have met Joel a couple times. He's a super nice guy. I tried to get him to come talk to one of my classes, but that did not work out. But for being one of the top sociologists of religion in Canada, he is at the super prominent and extremely prestigious Ambrose University in Calgary, right? Which is like, King's University in Edmonton. If you took it and cut it in half, right, because it's about half the size, that's Ambrose University. It's a really nice place, right? Super friendly people, really nice environment, but it's incredibly tiny. I think it's like, 600 students, roughly. So really small, right? Not a lot of prominent social science research on religion in Canada. Okay, I will meet Ryan Burge one day. He's still alive, so I can hunt him down. Go find him. And tell him how much I like his work. All right, so if we look at the US, right, if we talk about the religious composition of Americans, right, by generation. Okay, and this is as of 2024, so this isn't over time, right? What do we see? Well, our silence, right? About half of them are Protestant, 22% Catholic, and then 10% of them were nothing in particular, and 9% atheist agnostic, right? So about 20%, as of 2024, had no religious affiliation. And what you see is as you go, through the generations, Catholics are roughly kind of, slow decline generationally, from a high of 22% among the silents to a low in millennials and Gen Z of 16%. As you can see, there's been a sort of generational collapse of Protestantism in the US, very similar to Canada in that respect, right? Almost half of silents were or are Protestant, and it's only about between 27 and 22% of millennials and Gen Z. And of course, the only really, well, I guess the growing categories have been, our non-religious categories, right? Atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular, right? Millennials and Gen Z are relatively similar in their composition generationally, but basically, right, it's pretty close to 50% when we look at both of those categories. Okay, and this was data from a year earlier from the comparative election study. Slightly different numbers, right? So you always get slightly different numbers, but the story is kind of roughly consistent. The 2023 numbers gave us a much kind of more consistent Catholic number, but Protestants, right, really big decline and big growth in our atheist, agnostic, and nothing in particular, with not a lot of variance. Okay, so same data, right? And this is a year earlier again. So this is 2022. And here looking at just Gen Z and millennials, right? Gen Z slightly more or less likely to be Protestant, right, by about 5%. 1% difference in Catholics. That's margin of error, so we don't worry about that. Atheist, agnostic, pretty similar numbers, right? So their religious composition there is very similar, and nothing in particular, pretty similar, right? 3% difference, margin of error stuff. But Gen Z slightly less likely to be, or slightly more likely to identify as nothing in particular compared to millennials. Okay, now, why am I spending so much time on the nuns? So the nuns were nothing in particular, right? No religion. I'm just going to call them the nuns. And again, not the nuns. Not that one, this one. So when I say nuns, I don't mean, ladies with funny hats and, dressed kind of like penguins. I mean, people who just don't care about religion. The growth of the nuns is probably the biggest religion story of the past, 3 decades, right? Oh, I need to jump forward to this slide, right? Because this slide, I think, does a really good job of telling this particular story. Now, again, this endpoint is a little earlier than I'd like, because this is based on GSS data up to 2018. But you see the growth of no religion from 1980 to about just before 2020. Our last point is 2018, right? Explosive growth of nothing in particular, right? Or no religion. And it is probably the biggest religious change we've observed likely ever, right? Actually, I'm going to say likely ever is the movement from religious to nothing in particular. And I'll come back to this slide, right? But it is a huge story, which is why we talk about it. Do you think that when real Korea mercifully nukes the White House, we'll see another great awakening? Sure. I'll go with that. Is being an atheist considered a religious group? Sorry, this is kind of a dumb or obvious question. No, it's not a dumb or obvious question. I mean, we kind of put them in with religious groups, not so much because atheism is a religion, but it tells us something particularly about people who don't belong to religious groups, right? And that particular kind of identity. Now, I mean, I don't know if you noticed, if we go back to the Canadian data, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you all epilepsy by going backwards and forwards here, right? Canada does a really shit job of this in our social science data, because they just put everything, atheist, agnostic, and nothing in particular, into one category of no religion, without really differentiating things in a very sophisticated way. And I don't like the way the census question is asked, but weirdly, no one actually asked me if I approved of the census question, which I take umbrage, but there you go. Okay, so I don't actually take umbrage. I don't expect anyone to ask me about these things. Okay, flash forward. I'll use the slide select instead to not, cause all of you to have a seizure. Occurs to me, I have no idea what time it is. Just one moment, please. Okay, I'm doing okay. I got 40 minutes left. Okay, so the growth of the nuns, right, has been this really, really explosive thing. And it starts kind of in the 1990s, and it really explodes through the 90s and 2000s. And one of the things that a lot of social scientists, and here think maybe of our friends like Steve Bruce and his idea of late secularization, have expected that ultimately this would continue, sort of infinitely, right? So if you think of late secularization or religion as alien, right? That theory that we talked about with Steve Bruce. One of the things that theory sort of suggests is that each generation will be roughly half as religious as the last one, right? That religion sort of has a half-life, right? So every generational cohort is going to decline. Now, things to note here, right? When we talk about our millennial and Gen Z, like I said, what we have here appears to be remarkable sort of similarity. The numbers aren't exactly the same in this comparative election study data, but the religious composition of millennials and Gen Z is relatively similar, right? Especially when we talk about our nothing in particular, right? They're an atheist agnostic, they're pretty close, right? There's not a huge jump. Okay. And here, right, if we look at nothing in particular here in the 2022 data, that religious composition isn't miles away in terms of what they look like, although Protestant is down considerably. Okay, here, this is all Americans, right? So now we're not just talking about millennials and Gen Z, but what we have is sort of nothing in particular over a 4-year span, right? From 2020 to 2023, right? Now this is a different set of data, right? This is Pew Research, the Pew National Opinion Reference Survey, and I'll talk lots in a little bit about the Pew Religious Landscape data, because that's a different set of data altogether. But what we see, right, is when we talk about our nothing in particulars, at least over this 4-year period series, what the hell am I talking about? 4-year period is it looks like a plateau, right? Nothing in particular, rather than continuing to grow, looks like it's sort of hit, kind of stability. It starts in 2020 at 28% and it ends up back there in 2023. Okay, and if we look at this data, again, our comparative election study data, and here we got GSS data, what we see is, relative stability after and around 2020. Now, this is really interesting sort of data, right? Share of who have no religious affiliation by birth year among those born in 1980 or later, right? And what Ryan's done here is he's mapped 4 different years of the CES, basically onto birth years. But what you see is this kind of 2020 through 2021 data, all of these lines look pretty flat, right? There's not explosive growth in any of them. If anything, right, they look like they've sort of stabilized. And yes, let's say someone born in 1980, on this yellow line, is slightly less likely to have no religion than someone born in 2005, right? So there we're talking 1980, we're probably talking like first couple years of the millennials, versus, I guess 2005, we're sort of midway through Gen Z as a kind of generational cohort, right? But they're roughly as likely as each other to say that they are nothing in particular, right, in terms of the data. These lines are really flat, which suggests that in terms of generational growth, the nuns have kind of flattened out, right? There's not, they've sort of hit a plateau, and you might see a little bit of growth, but what it looks like is quite a bit of stability. Okay, so again, now this is all Americans, right, in the GSS, so all age groups. But what do we see, right? Somewhat similar story, right? We go back to 1972, our nuns are 5%, and right, we hit the 1990s, and here's what I said, right? 1990s, I guess like end of the 80s, right, to the 1990s, it grows really strongly. So that's your millennials, to an extent coming into the survey data, especially at the end of the 90s. 2000 is when you're going to see most of the millennials come in, and you take a big shot up, and it shoots up all the way to about almost 30%, And then this last little bit, right, is down in 2022. So people with no religious affiliation, it looks like a little bit of a plateau. Okay. I would never lie to you. As being an atheist, okay, I answered that. How useful is it to know the various subgroups of religious disaffiliation, degrees of noneness? I mean, we're going to talk about the nuns. So the next unit after this is actually called the nuns, right? So after we get through the religious landscape, we're going to deep dive into the nuns. And there's a few different categorizations of the nuns. And I actually have to go through and add some because Thiessen and Laflamme have one, and then Ryan Burge has a different one. And I kind of like, I like Ryan's a little bit better. My favorite one that he has is he calls them the Ninos, or nuns in name only, which is an interesting category. But let's not think about that. Okay, different set of data here. Okay, so this comes from 4 years of Springtide Research Institute, which if you know me, and some of you do, and you've taken like sociology of youth with me, you know how much I like the work that Springtide does. They basically do a survey of young people ages, I don't know if I can, 13 to 24 every year, right? And it's varied from about 1,000. I think the 2023 sample was about 13,000, and the 2025 sample was just under 3,000, 2,977. And you're like, how do you know the exact numbers? I spent a lot of time with this data. I'm not going to lie. Okay, so basically they ask a bunch of questions about youth and religion, which is useful to me in other contexts. But they put out a sort of religious landscape kind of pie chart in every one of their reports. And so every year this graph, I have to try and find a way to add one more pie, which the pies get smaller and smaller over time. Okay, so we're now up to 4 pies. So what do the pies tell us, right? Well, basically, our pies tell us that, and this is all Gen Z, right? So this is Gen Z, and just a little bit, like just the tip of Gen Alpha, right? Because we're starting to get 13, 14, Gen Alpha now would be about, 13, 14, yeah, 13, 14. So they're just like in this last part of the pie, right? The 2025 sample, and a little bit of the 2024 sample, we're getting just a touch of Gen Alpha. So here again, we're adding now another generational cohort. But what is the story on this, these 4 pies? Well, what we see, right, the percentage of Christians relatively stable, right? In the last one, it goes up a bit, and this may be something, or it may just be weirdness in the data, right? Just you happen to grab a slightly larger chunk of people who say that they're Christian in that sample, right? No religion sort of varies, and again, this is probably weirdness in the data, but somewhere between about a quarter to a fifth of Gen Z, Gen Alpha saying that they have no religion, right? And here I've included agnostic, atheist, nothing in particular. I didn't put something else because I don't know what that means, and I hate that category. And I wish they wouldn't use categories like something else because I really don't know what it means. And you can see they didn't consistently use it because there's no something else on this chart. They have spiritual but not religious, which is an interesting one as well. But something else represents 5-6% in some of these other samples. Okay, so what's the story here? Roughly speaking, it looks like our no religion has plateaued in Gen Z and the beginning part of Gen Alpha, right? So if we're thinking about our theories of secularization, can we say late secularization, right? Bruce's theory. Well, I think on this data, at least for the United States, you'd probably have to reject that theory, right? Because obviously something is, when it comes to growth of the nuns, we're not seeing it in the American context, right? Generation to generation, they look not that different. Okay. And again, if we go, all right. So Gen Z and millennials are just as non-religious as each other. Yeah, roughly speaking, right? There's not a lot of generational difference. Oh, you saw a lot of generational difference. All right, blinding flash backwards again. No, I'll go here, right? Big difference in terms of composition, compared to these three generations, right? The silence boomers and Gen X. But there seems to be a fair bit of stability when it comes to millennials and Gen Z. Okay. All right, just another way to kind of visualize it here. And again, this data from the CES, right, this time from 2008 to 2024, pardon me, oh dear. What you see, right, kind of steady growth until about here, at which point it really flattens out. I guess like here, right, you're looking at pretty flat numbers, right? Not a lot of variation. The big jump is from 2008 to kind of here. That's about a 6% jump, after which it sort of bumps around in a 4% range, kind of up and down, depending on the study, right, for nothing in particular. And as you can see, right, our atheist and agnostic, not a very big position overall, right? Somewhere between 3 and 7% for atheist, and 4 and 6% for agnostic, right? Okay. All right, same data, right? This time just broken down by generation, by generational cohort. And what do we see, right? Well, the silence, right? The share of the nuns has grown, seems to kind of peak around here, right? Same for the boomers, right? Grew 28%, kind of steadily here, and then sort of sinks back to 24. Same thing for Gen X, right? Every generation we're seeing disaffiliation, but pretty stable over time. And then again, look at your composition of our millennials and Gen Z. They're pretty similar, 42 versus 46. In 2023, they were exactly the same. 48 versus 44. These are all really small differences, right? So the generational composition in terms of nothing in particular, or no religious affiliation for millennials and Gen Z is really, really similar. Again, that kind of puts late secularization into a big question bubble, right? And probably, I would say, not just late secularization, but our inherited model, inherited, spelled with an I, the inherited model, right? Again, big question mark on that, because what we're seeing, right, we're continuing to move into late modernity or whatever you want to call it with no, but we sort of hit a plateau for no religion. And, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. Okay. So what has been the driving force in this creation of these large number of people who now consider themselves nothing in particular? Okay, I think you could make a strong case, right, that one of the things that has really contributed to it is the collapse of mainline Protestant denominations, right? And again, think back a couple slides ago, I was talking to you about the United Church of Canada, right? United Church of Canada, walk down the street in 1972, count 5 people, one of those people is part of the United Church of Canada, right? Today, walk down the street, count 100 people, 3 of them are part of the United Church of Canada, right? Huge difference in terms of the numbers. The same stories happened in the US, right? What we've seen is the collapse of your mainline denominations, right? Now, this is exactly the phenomenon that Stark and Fink were describing in the Churching of America, right? Was the collapse of older, more established forms of religion over time, right? And what we see, right, and if we look at our, hang on, let me redo this in the appropriate colors. So if we look at our main line, right, our main line has had this trajectory, down. Correspondingly, nothing in particular has had essentially the opposite trajectory, right, up. Now, I will say this graph doesn't tell the whole story because, again, Catholics in the US, they lose a lot of people. I mean, I think it's like, oh, what do they say? It's like roughly half of people who are raised Catholic leave by the time they hit their 30th birthday. And I've seen some estimates that say Catholics probably contribute about 40% of the nuns, despite being only about 20% of the population, right? So they roughly, contribute double the amount of nuns. It's just that the Catholic bucket gets refilled all the time by immigration. But the story of the rise of the nuns, I think, is, and I'm going to go back in orange, right, largely the story of the collapse of mainline Protestantism. Because if we look at Catholic and evangelical, right, those numbers, light blue, right, are kind of roughly stable. They're on a slow kind of decline path, but, relatively stable over time, right? Declining, but declining relatively slowly. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. All right. So, new set of data here. This is the Pew Religious Landscape data. Oh, I don't like blue. Back to red. All right. More visible, right? Pew Religious Landscape Survey. And Pew is seen, generally speaking, as one of the gold standards in religion research. And again, what do we see here? And this is between, just a relatively short period, between 2007, the 2007 RLS and the 2023-24 RLS. We see, right, our net Protestant, right? So all Protestants taken together. So that combines evangelical, historically black Protestant, and mainline Protestant into kind of one category, right? And they have seen a big drop, 11 percentage points down over this, less than 20-year period. Okay, this is mostly driven by the 7% loss in the mainline, right? The historically black churches have lost about 2%, and evangelicals are down about 3%, right? I don't know if they're counting Mormons as net Protestant here. Let me see. We got 11% down. No, so I actually got 12% here. Okay, so I'm overestimating them a little bit. Okay, doesn't matter. Oh, that's 40. That's back up. The end number is like 41. That makes sense. Okay, so, right, we have, here's our difference. Largely driven, right, by continued collapse in mainline churches, right? So exactly what we're talking about here, it's this slide of the orange line really driving the growth of nothing in particular. Okay, so Pew comes to roughly the same conclusion as what I've been presenting here, but the decline of Christianity in the US has slowed and may have leveled off, and the growth of the nuns has basically gone flat as well. Okay, now, that said, according to the 2019 RLS, right, lots of things were changing, and I'll just note like a couple, right? So, in terms of identification, right, what we see is across pretty much every category, right, fewer people were identifying as Christian, right, moving away across all demographics, right? So like men and women roughly at even rates, generational cohorts, obviously the millennials, on this survey had dropped 16%, and 13% more had become unaffiliated. Racial categories, white, black, Hispanic, right? All of them, same kind of thing. College and non-college educated, same thing. So a kind of steady decline of religion across the board, and in all regions, including the South, right? So the Bible Belt that we would often think of as very religious disaffiliation there too. And even amongst Republicans, right? a 7% decline in those identifying as Christian, but of course, dwarfed by ye old Democrats with a 17% decline, right? And most of those move to no religion or disaffiliated status. Okay. Now, huge generation gaps, right, in terms of identification with different religious groups. Again, with this data, with just a little under half of millennials as compared to essentially 8.5 out of 10 silence identifying as Christian, right? With millennials, it's barely half. Well, it's not even half, right, technically. If you count other religions, so even being religious, it's, just above 50% of millennials, but about 40% saying they had no religion. In terms of religious service attendance, right, drop-offs, again, by generation, with, roughly 60% of silence saying they attended once or twice a month or more. With the boomers, that's down to 48%. With Gen X, it's down to, 48%. 47% for our, 46%. I can read. Hey, that top number, 49% for the boomers. 46% for Gen X. For millennials, barely a third attending, once a month, once or twice a month or more, right? So, big numbers. Okay. And yeah, nearly 2/3 of millennials say they go to church a few times a year or less, right? So, general drops in not just religious identification, but also religious service attendance, right? So kind of consistently across the board. Okay, now, in that, among Christians, right, those who identify as Christian, roughly similar, right, in terms of their religious service attendance. Back in 2009 on the RLS, it was 62%. In the 2018-2019 RLS, it was 62%, right? So it hadn't really changed, but the takeaway is, overall, the change has been big because there are fewer Christians overall in the United States. The graphs are merging together. Well, that's why you review. Okay. Don't worry, we only have 17 minutes left, or so, until Erica goes. I don't know which. All right. So, in terms of attendance, okay, this now from the CES comparative election study shows, I think, a relatively similar sort of number, right? What do we have? If we look at our boomers, right, by the time we get to slightly updated, right, the boomers, slightly more likely. It's about 50-50, right, in terms of, never attending or yearly and monthly and weekly put together, right? It's roughly half. For Gen X, right, we're now, in minority territory, right, 43% in the last year. You see, right, it's a growing kind of thing that people attend never/seldom. For millennials, right, same kind of story over the span of these years. It went from slightly less than 50% to, almost 60%, 57%, and roughly 2/5, a little bit more than 2/5, attending either yearly, monthly, or weekly. I do think there's a big kind of difference between yearly and monthly, but whatever. And then Gen Z, right? Again, not particularly different from our millennials. It's about, I guess slightly less than half by this last wave, right? And it's roughly half, 50-50, and declining over time in the same way, right? Yearly, monthly, and weekly are all down amongst every generation, and we have growth in seldom and never attending across the board. Okay. terms of the total number of kind of people in each category, right? So this is US population, and again, this is the 2018-19 data. So this will have changed a little bit, though this number does look like it's roughly kind of has flattened out since then. Christians went from about 178 million to about 167 million in the US. So still a substantial number, but down a little bit. And our religiously unaffiliated, right, went from about 39 million in 2009 to about 68 million, right? So that's 11 million fewer Christians in a 10-year period, and about 30 million more people who consider themselves unaffiliated, right? So this is about as big a social science story as you're going to find. Okay. Okay, women, again, we're talking 2019. I'll update this in a sec. And again, between 2009 and 2019, basically what we saw was women still more religious than men, with about, at the beginning it was 73% of men were religiously affiliated. By 2019, right, it's down to 61. Women were a little bit higher to start at 80%. And came in at 69%, right? So both of them declining at pretty considerable rates, and the unaffiliated growing at roughly the same rate, right? It's about 10% for both of them, and the growth of non-Christian faiths, right, about a 2% growth for each. So both men and women, right, are becoming less religious over time. Okay. So this is the 2024. I told you, it gets a little bit messy because all of this gets complicated over time. By 2024, that had roughly flattened out, right? Where the share of, so the share of individuals who consider themselves Christian, right? 2007, 78, it had dropped to 29 by 2019 to 63. And that's where it stands in the most recent wave of Pew data, right? It's still at about 63. And the religiously unaffiliated, right? So this is the same data, so don't worry about this one here. Religiously unaffiliated, right? 2007, even I'm getting the dates mixed up now. 2007, right? 16%, grew up to about, 30-ish% up here, but then it's sort of flattened off here, right? So again, more data suggesting the growth in religious disaffiliation has really slowed down, and not that many people are now moving into that unaffiliated category. Okay. Have these red-pilled podcasts had any effect on religiosity at all? Or is it the same vibe as Trump just milking it because he knows he can get those people? I hope my question even makes sense. Okay, I do understand. I understand your question. It's really, really hard to tell, right? For one, if these religiously affiliated women tend to be older, lots of women in my family become more religious as time went on, but not the men. Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so let's answer the first question first. Okay, it's really hard to tell why people convert, right? I would tend to think like the red pill podcasts, right? I don't know what to call them. Even probably are only at the margins of bigger cultural trends, right? Largely because I don't know how many people actually consume them and how ubiquitous they actually are. But it's likely not one thing. There's likely a lot of things going on at the same time. But it is a really, really interesting question. If we're religiously affiliated with, okay, this is interesting. This is an interesting question. And it'll give you a break from the graphs while I answer it. Okay, do you know if these religiously affiliated women trend older in age? So yes, and I'll show you in a sec sort of what this looks like, because I've got some stuff on men and women a little bit. There are more graphs. I'm sorry. I promise we'll get through this as quickly as possible. No, she can't. It's 11 minutes. That's too long. I won't allow Erica to do that. I know 80-minute classes are brutally long. Okay. Oh, what was I answering this question with? Okay. So it's tended to be the case that across generational cohorts, women are slightly more religious than men, right? Now, in terms of the data on, do people get more religious as they age? The surprising thing is actually the answer tends to be no, right? People will actually, probably your peak kind of period for, oh, hang on, I need somewhere to write. I'll write here. Pay no attention to what's on this slide for the moment. Right, so your kind of peak ages for religiosity really tend to be about 28 through about 50, right? And the reason is largely kids, right? This is the period where a lot of people are kind of raising, younger children and adolescents, right? And a lot of people, will end up going to religious services, right, and attending a church or mosque or synagogue, largely because they have this idea, and this is, again, pretty robust in the data, that, that religion is going to help inculcate a sort of morality into their kids, right? And so it's a kind of support for morality building. What happens, though, is when you hit sort of, typically, last kid hitting adolescence, right, and sort of especially moving into kind of college years or adulthood, a lot of people then sort of reconsider what their religious affiliation. And you actually see, right, in the sort of 50 to 65 range, a fair bit of people just kind of falling off, especially in terms of religious service attendance, right? Like what you'll often find is that they might be like, in terms of identity, they might still identify kind of loosely with their whatever religion they were in, right? Whether it be Catholic or evangelical or Muslim or whatever, but they stop going, right? Because the purpose for them going was mostly to help them raise their kids. Once their kids are raised, they often sort of fade away, right? So what you'll tend to find is that the people who then stick around, right, and are still, say, attending religious services frequently are going to be those really, really devoted people, right, who really believe it 100%, rather than the other, the people who are there kind of marginally because they had, some other reason for it. And that tends to be what the data shows. Now, that said, historically, women have been more religious than men, and men have been a little bit more reluctant when it comes to religion than women are. So I think your observation is likely more or less correct, but I would say with some nuance. And yeah, actually, people do tend to get a little bit less religious as they age. Okay. I'm going to do a couple more slides, and then I promise I'll let you go slightly early, because you've been good sports to tolerate my mountain of graphs. Okay, so I say this is weird for a secular nation. So this is Pew data, right? Again, pew, pew. That's okay. At least you're paying attention, kind of, or you just imitated a sound you heard. The Pew Pew data. Okay, so, all right, 86% of Americans, according to this newest, this is our 2024 now, RLS data, 86% of them believe people have a soul or a spirit in addition to their physical body. 83% believe in God or a universal spirit, right? 79 believe there is something spiritual beyond the natural world, even if we can't see it. And according to this, 70% believe in an afterlife, heaven, hell, or both. All right, so if you wanted to make a case for, secularization, rest in peace, right? So this is our buddy Rodney Stark's theory. This would be a really, really good kind of cluster of data to cite, right? And why? Well, all of these are religious beliefs, right? So for all of the, okay, net believe one or more of the above. So 92% of the people they surveyed, and again, this is a huge survey, it's like 30,000 people, 92% had two or one or more of the above, right? So almost every American, right? 92 out of 100, so the people who don't, it's only 8 out of 100, right, who don't believe any of these things, right? So really only 8% that have no spiritual beliefs. These are all deeply spiritual beliefs, right? So if you're going to be like a Steve Bruce and say like, oh yeah, secularization is just around the corner, I think you have a tough job in explaining this, right? So supposedly secular Americans, right, somewhere between 25 and 30% of whom say that they have no religious affiliation, largely still believe that you have a soul, that there's a universal spirit, right, that there's something beyond the natural world, and that there is an afterlife, right, heaven, hell, or both, right? So spiritual beliefs and belief in the afterlife remain really, really robust among Americans, right? So is America a secular country? Not by this measure, right? And again, if we're taking church attendance, right, or religious service attendance as your measure, maybe. If you're taking unchurched spiritual beliefs, definitely not, right? Okay. No, we'll start here. We will start with youth, question mark. Yeah, we'll start here. We'll pick this up next time, and I don't know, I made adequate progress through this. I'm 35 out of 66 slides. Oh God, what have I done? Anyway, we'll look at this next time. Okay, we'll finish this up next time, and then next week we'll be on to something else. Hello. Oh, hang on. I want to turn the mic off. My voice has been amplified for too long. All right, what can I do for you?
I just wanted to talk about, I put the question of the red pill podcasters, because I just you always see them and they're like, oh, you have to be holy and have kids and I don't know, the Charlie Kirks and all those people.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I always wonder, is Andrew Tate included in the red pillars? I guess he